Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this lecture titled An Introduction to Mixed Methods Research. I am Dr. Moin Syed. I have a handy mnemonic that you can use to learn how to pronounce my name correctly. My first name is Moin, like coin, so coin but with an M, Moin. And my last name, Syed, is like psychology educator, Syed, so Moin Syed. I am an associate professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota in the US. The purpose of this lecture series is to give you a broad overview of mixed methods research. It really is assuming that you don't know much of anything about mixed methods, so assuming no background. And I've divided the lecture into 4 components. So these 4 components will help you break up the lecture a little bit so you don't have to watch it all at once. Honestly, I have no idea how long these will be because oftentimes I just start talking and sometimes I add things and sometimes I take things out and you never know what might happen. So in this case, I thought it would be best to split up into 4 sections. The first one is a broad background, really not directly related to mixed methods research per se, although it's situated within a mixed methods way of thinking, but just some broader issues in philosophy of science that I find are very relevant to trying to understand mixed methods research. The second lecture will focus on definitions of what is mixed methods research and why we should do it. The third lecture is on different mixed methods designs. There are many designs, but I'll go over some of the main ones and then provide examples for what those could look like. And then the final lecture is a much shorter one that I'll focus on strategies for publishing mixed methods research. So that's a question that often comes up. So throughout with these 4 lectures, you should get a broad introduction to some of the major issues that are involved in mixed methods research and understand what is meant by that term when we use it. So here I'll just launch right into lecture 1, background for mixed methods research. As I said, some very light philosophy of science. We're not going to go too deep on any of these issues. For some of you, this might be much too superficial. Really, I'm just hoping to provide some very general background kinds of ways of thinking that I find is useful when thinking about mixed methods research. So oftentimes, oh, I forgot to put this in there. The 4 issues that I will focus on are worldviews or paradigms, and then we'll talk about forms of theory, different modes of theory, what I call the steps in science, and then finally root metaphors. As I said, we'll just touch on sort of main topics on all these things and not get into really a lot of details. Here's the slide that I thought was coming next earlier. So oftentimes mixed methods research is discussed in terms of these different worldviews or these different paradigms. And in particular, they're often referred to as the quantitative paradigm and the qualitative paradigm or worldview. Those are often used interchangeably, and we don't need to get into what the distinction of those might be. Now, one thing I want to impress upon you is to not think about quantitative and qualitative themselves as paradigms. They are actually methods. And when you see scholars talking about these as paradigms, what they're really doing is using these terms, quantitative and qualitative, as proxies for what the paradigms actually are. In this case, for quantitative research, it's really post-positivism, and for qualitative research, it's constructivism. So often these are the paradigms that are guiding those particular methodological choices. Now, post-positivism and constructivism, they vary in terms of a number of dimensions, but we can think of variations in terms of ontology, or what the nature of being is and what can be known, epistemology, or ways of knowing and the relationship between the knower and the known, axiology, or the values and the role of values and what they play in our research, and then method, of course, which is already sort of redundant with what's there in terms of quantitative and qualitative. So with post-positivistic and constructivism, when comparing them on these 4 dimensions, you see quite a few differences. Ontologically, post-positivism focuses more on the idea that there is some sort of truth out there that can potentially be known, but that we ourselves are limited in our ability to really access it, that all of our work is an approximation of that truth rather than actually getting to know that truth. In contrast, constructivism focuses on the idea that there are multiple realities and multiple truths and not a singular truth to be known. The epistemological differences follow from this, where in post-positivism, the focus is on the idea that researchers can be objective and separate from the object of which they're studying. And so there's a strong emphasis on trying to get distance between the researcher and the subject, because that believed to be that's a way to be able to enhance the ability to achieve or get closer to this knowledge of reality or truth. Whereas in constructivism, that distance is rejected, that being objective is impossible, that there are subjectivities, the researcher subjectivities are always brought into the work, and that not only is it there, but you need to really fully consider it and take it into account when doing your work. Axiology is quite varied between these two approaches. Again, this is the role of values in the research process. Most post-positivistic work tends to really de-emphasize the role of values and suggest that research should be a completely neutral scientific affair, and the researcher's value should not be embedded in the work, although it's possible they might acknowledge that sometimes it does. The idea is that you should strive for it to not. In contrast, the constructivist perspective argues that researcher values are always ever present in the questions that we ask, the way we analyze the data, the way we disseminate data. All aspects of the research process sort of reflect the values of the researcher, and often this is made explicit so that it's clear what the role of values is that's motivating the work. And then method, which should already be clear, as already mentioned, oftentimes post-positivism is associated with quantitative methodologies, whereas constructivism is associated with qualitative methodologies. Although, as I've said, this need not necessarily be the case. Now, for years, these two different paradigms have really been at battle with one another. In fact, this is what's referred to as the paradigm wars, that there is a battle of strong disagreements between quantitative and qualitative research that are really irreconcilable. And this was a heavy debate in the 1970s and the 1980s across a number of disciplines, not so much in psychology, although it did exist in psychology, but you saw it a lot more in sociology, anthropology, critical studies, and a lot of other fields. There was a lot of discussion about these paradigms and the paradigm wars. And really, one of the main outcomes of the paradigm wars was just kind of these two approaches operating in separate domains. That there were quantitative researchers and there were qualitative researchers, and they generally didn't like each other. They didn't respect what each other did. They published in different journals. They were just sort of operating in parallel and in conflict with one another. Now, of course, that's not the case for everyone. For some, they were able to be harmonious and work together and be pleasant. But in general, the result of the paradigm wars was this large schism between quantitative and qualitative methods. And you still see that today, and it's very present in psychology. That really is a field that's dominated by quantitative methods, and qualitative research is very broadly seen as less rigorous, less relevant, less important, less scientific, and just really less worthy of us paying attention to. And you can see this quite clearly just looking at any of the major journals in the field. You'll see very few qualitative papers that are published in those journals. So, we'll talk more about that with the fourth lecture about strategies on publishing mixed methods research. But the schism continues to exist today. There is this clash between quantitative and qualitative research, but it has gotten better. It has improved. And one of the reasons why it has improved is because there's been the emergence of this so-called third way or third mode, which is the mixed methods paradigm. Now, again, it's sort of dangerous and inaccurate, I'd say, to refer to paradigms with respect to their methods. It really isn't about the methods. That's not the paradigm, but the methods are a proxy for some other sort of philosophical position. In this case, the paradigm that's associated with mixed methods is referred to as pragmatism. And what pragmatism is all about is sort of rejecting this ideological alignment that either you must be in the post-positivistic world with all the ontological, epistemological, axiological assumptions and beliefs, or the qualitative world with all those associated beliefs and assumptions, but rather that these aren't necessarily always in such great conflict with one another, and that it is possible to merge the two in productive ways. In particular, one of the focuses of mixed methods research as a philosophical position, or at pragmatism, is focusing on methods not as following from these different philosophical underpinnings, but really as tools, right? Focusing on methodological tools that can help address research questions. Mixed methods research is often referred to as problem-focused research. That is, you start first with specifying your question. What is your research question? Then you determine which methods you should use to address that question, right? Now, it seems to me, I always feel a little silly saying that kind of thing, because it seems like that's sort of obvious. That's the way it should be. We should always be specifying our question and then addressing it using the best possible methods, the methods that make the most sense that would address that question. But that's not necessarily the case, especially in psychology, because psychology is so firmly rooted in only doing quantitative research that actually does shut the door to a number of research questions that are more appropriately addressed via qualitative research methods or potentially mixed methods. So if you are only willing to consider quantitative methods, that really does constrain the range of questions. That's not doing question-focused research, because you've necessarily already bracketed your emphasis to be some kind of study or a research question that can be addressed with a quantitative-based study. So mixed methods is all about trying to bridge the paradigm wars and argue that synthesis is in fact possible. So that's something we'll discuss in great detail. Now, one of the reasons why some of this conflict does not make sense from a mixed methods or pragmatist perspective is that many researchers often have the same goals, even those who are pursuing quantitative and qualitative research, and sometimes they don't have the same goals, and so there's a good reason for why there might be this schism. And so it's good to sort of take a step back and think about why you're doing what it is you're doing, or what's motivating the work that you're doing. I think this is interesting to think about in terms of different types of theoretical perspectives or structures. And here I'm going to provide a very simplistic kind of overview of two different approaches to theory. Now, again, this is very basic. Some might say overly simplistic, but it does identify in general how the sciences approach theory and the humanities approach theory, and they are quite different. And we can look at a number of different domains to see the ways in which theory is approached differently in the sciences and in the humanities. So first of all is the purpose. Why is the theory even being developed in the first place? In the sciences, it's really to make predictions. That's the purpose of a theory, is to be able to integrate various descriptions and explanations in order to be able to generate new testable hypotheses that can ultimately reinforce those theoretical positions and then lead to some sort of reliable understanding of behavior that can then generate new predictions about behavior, mental processes in new situations. So developing principles, developing laws, being able to understand something about the reliable environment. Again, this generally follows from a post-positivistic view of the world in which there's some sort of truth or reality that we could potentially understand. In contrast, humanistic theory is not focused on making those kinds of predictions. It's focused on just developing a deeper understanding of a particular subject. It's about understanding the intricacies, the nuances, all the details of a particular phenomenon. So it's about getting a robust understanding, oftentimes in terms of getting enhancing the complexity to get greater understanding. In contrast, scientific theory, we often favor parsimony, right? We want a simpler explanation, the simplest possible explanation with the most explanatory power. That's typically sort of a property of scientific theories that we're searching for. Whereas in humanistic theories, that's not necessarily the case. In terms of the motive of what's the purpose of the theory, I already alluded to this a little bit with scientific theories. The ultimate motive is mastery. The intention is to develop principles and laws and understand some sort of regularity in human behavior and mental processes. Here, of course, I'm talking about in the psychological domain. Whereas, this is true for sciences in general, but be able to really master knowledge, to understand it with such depth and precision that we can make accurate predictions, which can then allow us to control that behavior and intervene as we need to. We'll come back to that later, but the goal is really mastery. In humanistic thought, however, the focus is not mastery, but on discernment. Again, this is part of the deeper understanding of some phenomenon is to be able to draw distinctions between that phenomenon and some other phenomena, to be able to pull important components apart. Even as you're integrating and getting a deeper understanding, you're still sort of partitioning off irrelevant information or information that doesn't actually bring a deeper understanding into what your particular phenomenon is. And so to have that sort of keen eye, to have a really perceptive, sort of thoughtful analysis is really the motive of humanistic theory, and not to develop this mastery over the subject. Closure refers to what the ultimate goal is, sort of what's the end point of these theoretical perspectives. In the sciences, again, I've already mentioned this, is really to develop laws. So we have hypotheses, are statements about relations, testable statement of relations in the world. Principles are relations that tend to hold up most of the time, whereas laws are relations that hold up, quote, all the time. Nothing is 100% guaranteed, but just about all the time. And so ultimately in the sciences, what we're searching to do is develop these laws. In contrast, in humanities, what the ultimate goal in the humanities, humanistic theory, is to develop a strong metaphor, to be able to have this metaphorical representation that allows this deeper understanding, facilitates the understanding and the discernment. So it's not to try to come up with a law that says that governs all of human behavior or even a particular domain of human behavior, but rather to have this really useful metaphor that captures this particular phenomenon. So a very different end result. So again, and here the result is what we're learning from this. So a well-formulated, sort of closed-out theoretical perspective in the sciences leads to some knowledge about reality, right? This is from a post-positivist perspective. It may not be that we actually are understanding reality, but our closest possible approximation of reality. But that's what we're yearning for, is to develop some understanding of truth or reality. Whereas the humanistic perspective is about identifying patterns. So interrelations, complexities that might not otherwise have been noticed, and that those patterns and interconnections are from a subjective perspective, and that they could vary subjectively from observer to observer. And that potentially could be built into the theoretical model as well. So it's not a reality, but rather the way subjective patterns recognition. Finally, these two theoretical perspectives are quite different in terms of when they're rejected. So how do you know that a particular theory is not appropriate or does not fit the circumstance? In a scientific theory, that ought to be through falsification. So we should be setting up our scientific theories and hypotheses by proxy as falsifiable. So we test our theories and we look for disconfirming evidence. And if we continually find that, we have to revise the theory or maybe ultimately reject it if we find that there's no support. In contrast, a humanistic theory is because it's not subject to test. That's not how it works. And so ultimately, the way it's rejected, it just falls out of favor. So it's no longer seen as a useful metaphor anymore. It no longer is seen as adequately capturing the patterns that are observed or developing this sense of understanding or adequately discerning amongst multiple topics. And so rather than being falsified and put to the test, it's just, you move on. It's no longer of interest to us anymore. And so we no longer engage with that theoretical perspective. So again, this is a very simplistic kind of view on these two theoretical perspectives, but it does provide kind of a broad understanding of where some researchers might be coming from. In particular, in psychology, think to yourself, which do we align with? Are we doing more scientific work, or are we doing more humanistic work? You can sit and reflect on that for a while I take a sip of water. So my response to that is we do a little bit of both. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we're often in trouble. I think we are in the science column, but often we are pulling much more from the humanities column. So we really do our research with a jumble of this kind of work. And I think it's important to understand that's the case, and that sometimes leads us into some problems. For example, in terms of rejection of theories in psychology, it's rarely because we've falsified them. It's much more often because they've fallen out of favor. These are just, we're not interested in this topic anymore. We're not interested in this research. And oftentimes theoretical perspectives, theories in psychology continue to exist even after they've seemingly been falsified. And we're seeing that a lot right now in terms of open science movement and replication crisis. In general, there are theories that seem like they should die and be done and we should move on, and yet they stick around. And in part that's because of this humanistic perspective. They're still seen as useful, they're still seen as providing some understanding, sometimes even a metaphorical representation, and that's seen as beneficial. Then in terms of mapping this onto mixed methods, so we can see part of the conflict that we see in the paradigm wars is that some folks, again, those who are more aligned with qualitative methods, tend to be coming at their theoretical work from a humanistic perspective, whereas others who are identified with quantitative research come at it more from the scientific perspective. And so if you truly have two researchers who very well align with these two perspectives, they're very likely going to disagree on a whole bunch of stuff, including the proper methodology to be using to conduct their work. Part of what we can see with mixed methods, though, is that you can use both quantitative and qualitative research with either of these modes. So it's not that one dictates the other. Scientific work does not mean quantitative work necessarily, because the qualitative work in mixed methods research can contribute to everything that's in the sciences column. Likewise with the humanities. This can be seen quite clearly if we think about what I often refer to as the steps in science. These are sort of the phases that science should go through as it's developing. Now, didn't mention, but as psychological researcher, I'm particularly interested in the scientific way of thinking. I do think that our preoccupation with the idea of whether or not we're a science has caused us a lot of trouble over the years. But in general, I believe in approaching psychology from a scientific perspective, and that generally, in looking back at the science and humanities mode, that I generally align with the scientific approach. That's the work, the sort of the area that I seek to work in. That's not to say that the humanistic approach isn't valuable. It certainly is. It's important. I'm not setting up one as better than the other, but in terms of being a psychological researcher, I see more value for that particular area in the scientific mode. So if we're thinking about the steps in science, then what does that mean for mixed methods research? What does that mean for the state of psychology? So what this is about is, let's pretend we're developing a new science, right? And we don't know anything about anything. We'll call it psychology, right? And we know nothing about psychology. We're going to start this new science. Where do we begin? What do we start with? If you know absolutely nothing, probably the best place to start is observation. Start observing people. So let's take the example actually of developmental psychology. Right? So in developmental psychology, really a relatively recent field, started around the early 1900s, there were just simple basic questions were not known about children. It's kind of shocking how little was known about children. What do babies do? How do they function? How do they change over time? None of this was known. And so the way developmental psychology really started as a field is through observation of what was called these baby bios. Baby bios. You can look some of them up. Actually, Charles Darwin wrote one about his son. The baby bios were just intense observational studies of individual children, case studies. This is what this child did. This is the arm movements. This is how they crawled, all those kinds of things, just detailed observations to be able to say, here's what we see kids doing. All right, so this is really what you need to do when you're starting off with a new science, is have this sense of observation. Once you do that extensively and you've observed quite a bit and you feel like you have a good sense for what the variations are and who to observe and what to observe, then you can pull those observations all together and start describing them. You can start providing some descriptive statistics, means, what happens on average, standard deviations, what's the variation around that average, ranges, what's the lowest bound and the upper bound, right? So if we're talking about, for example, when do children begin to walk, we start to learn and pull together based on observations and realize that, okay, it's around, on average, babies begin to walk around 12 months. There tends to be a range of about 7 months to 15 months, right? So we start to be able to describe what's happening and provide some more sort of some systematic understanding of those observations. So it's taking the observations and making it more systematic. Once we feel like we can describe behavior really well, what we want to move into is explanation. We can describe why a baby walks around 1 year, but why? Why does the baby walk around 1 year, right? That is much more difficult. This is starting getting into trying to understand, testing hypotheses about potential causal factors that could be related to why some particular phenomenon is observed, right? So this is testing hypotheses, starting to develop theories, and so on. Once we feel like we can explain really well, the next step is to be able to predict that behavior in a new situation. So first we need to be able to explain the behavior. Here's why this happens. If we really understand why it happens, then we can say, okay, we know what's going to happen in this new situation, right? So that's why explanation comes before prediction. Prediction is the ability to say, here's when this thing is going to happen, okay? Comes after explanation. Finally, if we know when something is going to happen, we can engage in the fifth step, which is controlling that behavior, right? If we know why it happens, when it happens, then we can modify it in some way. Now, control sounds a little bit sinister here, and perhaps it is, but we engage in psychological control all the time. There's a whole world of intervention research that goes on. Therapy is a form of control. Medication is a form of control, right? These are all instances of where we're trying to control individuals' behavior and mental processes. And there's a good reason, which you can see here through these steps, why those forms of control don't really work, right? Of course, there's variability, but a lot of interventions and a lot of therapy and a lot of medication don't work that well. Sometimes they work okay for some people, but in general, our forms of psychological control are not particularly effective. They're not particularly effective because we can't really predict much behavior in people, in part because we can't really explain it. And one of the reasons why we can't really explain it is we haven't really spent a lot of time just trying to describe it. And we haven't really described it much because we haven't observed it, right? So given that, reflect for a second. Where do you think psychology really is as a field? Where do we spend most of our time in these steps in science? And I'll have another drink of water. Okay, I think there's a lot of debate about this. No one's really going to agree, but we're somewhere within the realm of description explanation. We're definitely trying to do a lot of explanation. This is anyone who's ever submitted a manuscript for publication that was primarily descriptive probably has gotten the comment saying, oh, this is only descriptive. Where's the explanation? Where's the mechanism? Right, the focus on mechanisms, mediators, right? This is trying to get an explanation that we really are trying to emphasize explanatory processes, or criticisms for having correlational studies instead of experimental studies, because experimental studies can get causal effects better than correlational ones. I'm not going to get into that lion's den. That's controversial as well. But that's often the case. And the reason why experiments are often seen as the gold standard is because they provide a window into explanation, whereas correlational studies are much more focused on description. They try to get at explanation, but maybe aren't as good at it, or at least that's the perception. So we really have a fixation on explanation, but we're still not able to do it very well. Most of the studies, even if you find a statistically significant mechanism of some kind, it's not doing a very good job of explaining, and certainly not for an entire sample or an entire population. So we're sort of in the mode of explanation and description, but we don't do very much observation because we're really focused on quantitative work. We're really fixated on that level 3 and being quantitative and seeking explanations, but oftentimes we don't even know what it is we're talking about. We don't even understand the phenomenon or the concept enough because we haven't really observed it. There's been a lot of discussion in social psychology in particular around this concept of ego depletion. In particular, that it's been sort of subject to a number of failed replications and a lot of doubt about whether ego depletion even exists as a construct. Part of the problem there is no one was ever really clear, as far as I'm concerned, on what exactly ego depletion was, because it hadn't really thoroughly gone through the process of observation and description to be able to get at ego depletion, to then create those explanations, and to be able to test. That would have been perhaps more robust. And certainly that's the idea, that if you spend a lot of time on observation and description, then you should be able to develop much better explanations. And here, hopefully you can see a clear connection to mixed methods research, and thinking of mixed methods as a programmatic kind of way of thinking throughout both an individual researcher's agenda, but also the field. That clearly steps 1, 2, and 3 to an extent favor qualitative research, qualitative methods, whereas 3, 4, and 5 tend to get more into the quantitative side. Now, it's not to say that quantitative methods aren't useful for 1, 1, and 2, or that qualitative aren't useful for 4 and 5. They certainly are. But in general, when we're talking about observation and description, qualitative methods is really where we should be. And given how little we know in psychology and how unclear we are about many of our phenomenon, we really should be, much more of us should be qualitative researchers, and we should be focusing much more on the observation and description side of things, and hope that in our career, in our lifetime, we'll be able to deal with explanation. But that's not the way things are. We're much too impatient for that, and explanation is where all the action is. That's seen as doing the real science of psychology, which is unfortunate and has led to a lot of shaky findings and poor practices, honestly. Just leave that out there and then move on. Okay, the last issue in this introductory lecture is focusing on root metaphors. Now, root metaphors are a very different kind of thing, I think, and I found that most students or psychology researchers in general haven't really been exposed to root metaphors extensively. So this comes from Stephen Pepper's book, World Hypotheses, and in his analysis he found that all scientific endeavors can be classified into one of 4 types in terms of the underlying approach, which has a number of assumptions built into them and actually guides the research that they're doing to a much greater extent than they realize. Okay, so the first one is what's called Formism. So this is the idea of sort of being able to categorize the natural phenomenon into discrete entities or categories. So you have multiple category 1, 2, 3. And that this sort of categorical enterprise is one form of doing science. A really great example of this is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association that guides much of the diagnosis in clinical psychology. It really focuses on these discrete categories, right? So this is a formistic way of thinking, that we have these different categories that can be treated as distinct as one another. In modern psychological research, we see this a lot with cluster analysis and latent class analysis, and latent class growth modeling is creating these different categories of people. You know, men are from Mars and women are from Venus, right? That old John Gray book, nonsense. That lies within this particular metaphorical representation of science. The second one is what's called mechanism, or the metaphor of the machine. More recently, the metaphor tends to be more about computational machine or a computer, but in general it's about a machine, that there are these direct sort of causal linkages. If you put some sort of input, you get some kind of output, and that these can go through a series. So in this diagram, you have an input that leads to some mechanism, some mediator that then leads to some kind of output. And that this should look very familiar to everyone in psychology. I'd say this is by far the most dominant root metaphor in psychological research, especially mainstream psychological research. Sort of mechanism really emphasizes causality. It emphasizes distinguishing between variables. So we can say these are the inputs, this is the mediator, and these are distinguishable, separable items. Yeah, causation is really a main focus. Whereas in formism, we have separation is important, but causation is not. Formism is sort of agnostic about causation. It's a classification system, but not trying to determine causation among different elements. That's very much a focus on mechanism. So separation is a focus, but or a commonality between the two, but not the focus on relations between the two. The third one is organicism. So this is the root metaphor of the organic form. Organicism focuses much more on sort of natural processes, sort of the intertwining of the natural world, and the idea that we as humans or any natural process sort of follows a teleological function, so that our development essentially will unfold as it's supposed to, absent any kind of negative intervention. So the idea that we have some kind of, sometimes could be referred to as a genetic program or social program or whatever it might be, but something that sends us on a particular path, that as long as nothing gets in its way, that's the path it's going to go on. Organicism focuses heavily on the interrelations amongst components of the system. So it's really systems thinking. So when you take family systems theory, for example, actually a lot of work in developmental psychology tends to follow the organic metaphor, especially I'm thinking about stages of development and how development occurs over time, that much of it is sort of natural and follows sort of a progression that will vary based on social and genetic conditions, but in general there's this sort of unfolding of process. And also the idea, what's interesting about organicism in contrast to mechanism is really rejecting the idea of causality. Because all aspects are part of an interrelated system, it's basically impossible to identify any particular causal process, that everything is too tightly linked to be able to say that one input causes one output. Okay, and then the last one is contextualism. Contextualism is quite different from the others. That's my really fancy technical drawing of what contextualism looks like. Contextualism focuses on, as the name suggests, on the idea that in this case, human behavior and mental processes is highly dependent on time and context and circumstances and the individual, that there's really, you have to take all these different factors into account to truly understand any particular phenomenon, and that they're largely going to be non-reproducible across multiple situations. Okay. So these four root metaphors really underlie, according to Pepper, they underlie all psychological or all scientific work, although in some fields, some might be more heavily emphasized than others. So again, mechanism is really big in psychology in general, and then I'd say organicism is quite large in developmental psychology. However, I'll briefly illustrate, you can actually see all four of these at play, even in the same research domain. So here, I'll give you all a second. Do everyone know who this is? Use this as another water break. Yep, this is Erik Erikson. So identity is one of my major areas of research, and Erikson is often referred to as identity's architect. He really brought the idea of identity to popular and scientific thought, I'd say. And if you look at modern day Ericksonian identity research, you actually can see research that fits into all four of these metaphors. I'll comment that in general, I'd see Erikson's theory as an organic metaphor, fitting with the organic metaphor. But the ways in which it's been investigated in research actually fits all four of these forms. So speaking of formism first, this is the identity status model. So the idea that by understanding these two dimensions of exploration and commitment, these two processes, won't go into a lot of details of it, we can understand something about individuals' developmental processes with respect to identity. So we can classify them as achieved, moratorium, foreclosed, or unexamined. So these are categorical placements, forms, based on some underlying criteria that are discrete, right? So this is the formistic way of thinking. In contrast, we could think of exploration and commitment as two continuous processes that sort of unfold over time. And in general, that will increase over time, at least into adulthood. And so here I'm giving the example with ethnic identity, where we see commitment and exploration both increasing over time, but at different rates. So not looking at categorical assignments, not forms, but rather these organic processes. A mechanistic view would focus on maybe ethnic identity exploration and commitment as outcomes and trying to understand what might lead to those outcomes occurring. So here we could talk about socialization from friends, family, and community as being sort of the inputs that lead to these different levels of ethnic identity. So again, here, this is more of like, here's how this unfolds over time. Here is what predicts those values, right? Different kind of emphases. And then finally, contextualism, you can look at sort of individuals and look at the role of family, friends, community, time, and everything else, really. There's nothing that's off out of bounds when looking at contextualism and how they all interrelate and are interconnected with one another. And you could do this for multiple individuals, look for similarities and differences across. And so you can have all three of these, or all four of these root metaphors embodied in any particular area of research. And that is a bit of a problem in terms of thinking about the cumulativeness of your research. So how do you integrate research across these four metaphors into actually being able to understand something about the particular phenomenon? That's sort of a topic for another day, but it is definitely a challenge. But again, you can see here how these different root metaphors might map onto different quantitative emphases. So mechanism in particular really lends itself to a quantitative approach, whereas contextualism really lends itself to a qualitative approach. Formism and organicism really could take quantitative or qualitative methods. You see, especially formism, really you see both there. So method doesn't necessarily map onto each of these, but it does sometimes kind of align. So sometimes when you have quantitative and qualitative researchers who might be in conflict with one another, part of that conflict is because they have these different root metaphors that are underlying their perspectives. Okay, so that was a lot to cover in a short amount of time. And hopefully you have time to sort of sit and think with those ideas a little bit. Like I said, I didn't go into much depth on any of that. Really the focus was trying to suggest that there's actually quite a bit underlying all of this. When we talk about worldviews and paradigms and methods, it's not just so simple as saying, well, there's quantitative methods and qualitative methods, but that those different methods can map onto a lot of different debates. And one of the reasons why they might not be meshing with one another is because of different positions on these different debates. So to wrap up this particular section, this lecture, one of the main points to think of is that method truly is independent of these four different philosophical issues that I brought up. So in terms of paradigm, whether using constructivism or post-positivism, you can use quantitative or qualitative methods with either of those. Whether you're doing scientific or humanistic theory, you can use quantitative or qualitative methods with either of those at all the phases of science, and no matter what root metaphors you're using. So it's both the case that you can use qualitative, quantitative mixed methods in any of these kind of different situations, but it's also the case that when most are arguing for a position, if they're arguing for quantitative or they're arguing from qualitative, they're arguing from one or more of these particular positions. And so it's useful to know, and that's not always at their level of awareness. They're not always fully realizing that they're actually, in making that claim, they're also tethering that claim to one or more of these particular philosophical positions. So it's just important in terms of awareness when thinking about these methods and thinking critically about different methods that we understand how these different issues map on. Okay, and now with that, it's time for a fika, and we'll see you soon.